The sound of boots on the cold concrete echoed through the narrow alleyway, the rhythmic march of soldiers growing louder with each passing second. In the distance, the unmistakable hum of a factory's machines filled the air, a constant reminder of the war raging around them. The year was 1942, and Europe was entrenched in the depths of a conflict that threatened to swallow the world whole. The streets of Krakow were eerily quiet, yet there was an undercurrent of fear and tension that was impossible to ignore. Oskar Schindler, a man who had once lived a life of luxury and ease, now found himself at the crossroads of his own conscience. Dressed in a fine suit, his appearance still resembling that of a wealthy businessman, he moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a sense of urgency. He was a German war profiteer, a member of the Nazi Party, a man whose past was rooted in opportunism and personal gain. But in this moment, he was something else entirely. He was about to make a decision that would change the lives of over 1,000 people, a decision that would mark the beginning of a journey he never could have imagined. The factory doors loomed ahead, a cold metal barrier between the world outside and the lives of those trapped inside. Inside, the workers, Jews from all walks of life, moved with a sense of quiet desperation, their every action monitored by the watchful eyes of the Nazi guards. They were the lifeblood of the factory, their labor essential to the German war effort. But to the Nazis, they were nothing more than tools, disposable and replaceable. Schindler had seen it all before: the abuse, the degradation, the lives destroyed without a second thought. Yet as he walked past the workers, something inside him stirred. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and he could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. These were people, real, living beings with families, dreams, and hopes, and they were being hunted down, condemned to a fate no one should ever endure. He stopped in the middle of the factory floor, watching as the workers went about their tasks. A woman no older than 20 glanced up from her work, her eyes locking with his for just a brief moment. There was fear in her gaze, but there was also something else, something Schindler couldn't quite place. It was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would do something, anything, to stop the horror. Schindler's heart raced as the weight of the moment crashed over him. He knew what the Nazis were capable of, knew that every day his workers spent in the factory brought them closer to the gas chambers. But there was more. He had learned of the plans to liquidate the Krakow ghetto, to send the people to the camps. The very thought of it made his blood run cold. The decision was clear. He had to act. But how? He was no hero, no warrior on the battlefield. He was just a businessman, a man who had built his wealth on the backs of others. Yet in this moment, he realized that he held the power to change lives, to make a difference. The question now was whether he had the courage to do so. Just as Schindler began to form a plan, a sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the SS officers, his eyes narrowing as he approached. Schindler's stomach twisted with dread, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had already made his choice. "Schindler," the officer barked, "what are you standing there for? Get back to work." For a moment, Schindler hesitated. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. But then, without a word, he straightened up, his mind racing. He would do whatever it took to protect these people. He would fight, not with weapons, but with his influence, his wealth, and his cunning. As the officer turned away, Schindler's gaze fell once again on the workers, on their weary faces, their eyes full of fear and uncertainty. He knew that time was running out. The factory had become their only chance for survival, and he had just become their only hope. With that thought, Schindler turned and walked toward his office. His mind was already working, calculating, strategizing. He had to find a way to protect them, to keep them alive. But as he stepped into the office, one question gnawed at the back of his mind. Would it be enough? The door slammed shut behind him, and the factory fell silent once more. The fate of the workers rested now in the hands of a man who had once been nothing more than a profiteer. The future was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever. But Schindler knew one thing for certain. The war was far from over, and neither was his fight. The tension in the factory had reached a boiling point. The rhythmic clatter of machines, once a mundane sound, now seemed like a drumbeat echoing the inevitable march toward destruction. Schindler paced the floor of his office, eyes flicking toward the workers below, each of them unaware of the immense weight of his decision. In that moment, he was no longer a businessman, no longer the man who had once craved wealth and luxury. He was something else, something much more dangerous. His thoughts were clouded, torn between what was morally right and what was legally acceptable. He had seen the reports, the lists of Jews to be deported. He had heard the rumors of what awaited them, the concentration camps, the death camps, the gas chambers. The very thought of it made his blood run cold. How could anyone stand by and let that happen? And yet Schindler knew that every action he took, every decision he made, would only drag him deeper into danger. His phone rang, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. He hesitated, staring at the receiver for a moment before picking it up. It was Itzhak Stern, his accountant, the man who had come to mean more to him than just a business partner. Stern had been a lifeline in the midst of chaos, helping Schindler navigate the treacherous waters of the Nazi regime. "Mr. Schindler," Stern's voice crackled through the receiver, his tone laced with worry. "I've heard word of the ghetto liquidation. They're rounding up the people. They're taking them. Schindler, they're sending them to the camps." Schindler's heart sank. He knew it was coming. He had feared this moment for days, and now it had arrived. The terror in Stern's voice mirrored his own feelings, but Schindler couldn't afford to falter now. He had to act. "Do we have any time?" Schindler asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "There isn't much," Stern replied, his voice low. "I've heard they plan to start tomorrow. We have to move fast." Schindler stood up abruptly, pacing the small room, his mind racing. He had made a decision: to use his factory as a refuge for as many Jews as he could, to save them from the horrors that awaited them. But the situation was more complicated than he had anticipated. The Nazis were relentless, and the more Schindler protected his workers, the more attention he drew to himself. His relationship with the Nazi officers was tenuous at best, and there was always the looming threat of betrayal. "Start making the list," Schindler ordered, his voice sharp with resolve. "We'll save as many as we can." The phone call ended, and Schindler sank into his chair, his mind still reeling. The list. It was the only way. He had to move quickly, or else the workers, his workers, would be lost forever. The factory had become their sanctuary, but it was also their prison. Schindler realized that the only thing keeping them safe was his influence and his wealth, and both were running thin. He had already paid off officials, bribed soldiers, and pulled every string he could. But now he needed more. He needed to make the impossible happen. As he sat there lost in thought, his secretary Emily entered the room, her face pale with concern. She had been working with him for months now, and though Schindler had kept his actions mostly secret, she could sense the change in him. She could see the toll this was taking on him. "Mr. Schindler," Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure this is the right thing to do? The risk it's too great." Schindler's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he saw the same fear reflected in her gaze. She was right, of course. The risk was greater than anything he had ever faced. The consequences could be deadly, but the thought of doing nothing, of watching as innocent lives were destroyed, was far worse. He clenched his fists, a mixture of anger and determination surging through him. "Emily, you know what's happening out there. You know what they're doing to them. I can't stand by and do nothing." She nodded, but her concern was still evident. "But what if they find out? What if they suspect you? You've seen how they deal with traitors." Schindler leaned back in his chair, his mind already working, already planning the next steps. He couldn't afford to be weak now, not when so many lives were on the line. "I'm not going to be a traitor," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm going to save as many people as I can. I'll do whatever it takes." Emily looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, a faint glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She had seen the man Schindler used to be, the opportunist, the businessman focused solely on profit. But now she saw something else. She saw a man who was willing to risk everything for the sake of others. "I'll help," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. Schindler gave her a nod of thanks, then turned his attention back to the task at hand. The list. He had to finish it. Every name, every worker he could save, had to be accounted for. But as he sat there making his plans, He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Nazi officers were already suspicious, already watching him. The more he pushed, the closer he came to crossing a line he couldn't uncross. It was then that Schindler received another call, this one from an unexpected source. Eamon Goeth, the brutal SS officer in charge of the nearby labor camp. Schindler's stomach twisted at the thought of Goeth. The man was a sadist, known for his cruelty and ruthlessness. He had no sympathy for anyone, especially not Jews. Schindler, Goeth's voice boomed over the phone. I need to speak with you. In person. Schindler's heart skipped a beat. He knew this was it, the moment he had been dreading. He had no idea what Goeth wanted, but he knew it wouldn't be good. I'll be there, Schindler replied, his voice betraying none of the fear he felt inside. As he hung up the phone, the weight of the moment settled over him. He was walking into the lion's den. The risk was greater than ever, but Schindler couldn't back down now. Too many lives depended on him. With a final glance at the factory floor below, Schindler grabbed his coat and headed toward the door, the tension in the air thick enough to choke him. The next move would determine everything. And in that moment, Schindler knew. Something big was about to happen. Something that would change the course of the war, and his life forever. The night was cold and the streets of Krakow were almost deserted, save for the occasional muffled footsteps of soldiers patrolling the perimeter. Schindler's pulse quickened with every step he took toward a Mongoose mansion, the fear of the unknown weighing heavily on his chest. The factory, once a place of relative calm amidst the madness of war, had become the last sanctuary for his workers. Now everything hung in the balance, and the decisions made tonight could determine their fate. Goeth was a monster, an embodiment of the SS's cruelty. The man had already shown a complete disregard for human life, gleefully executing anyone he deemed unnecessary. His presence, both physical and psychological, loomed over Schindler like an insidious specter. The thought of negotiating with him, of facing him face to face, left Schindler nauseated. But he had no choice. Time was running out. Schindler arrived at Goeth's mansion, the imposing walls and barbed wire gates serving as a silent reminder of the nightmare that had gripped Poland for the past few years. He was met at the door by a cold, silent soldier who ushered him inside with barely a glance. As Schindler stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the harsh smell of smoke and alcohol filled the air. He could hear Goeth's unmistakable voice from a nearby room, barking orders at his underlings. Schindler took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He could not afford to show weakness, not now. He had to be bold, to play the game with the same cold calculation that had served him so well in business. But this was not a business deal. This was life and death. Schindler! Goeth's voice rang out, drawing Schindler's attention. The SS officer was lounging in a chair, a drink in hand, his demeanor casual, as if the world outside were a distant concern. Goeth! Schindler replied, his voice calm but steady. I've come to talk about the workers in my factory. They're in danger. I'm here to see what can be done. Goeth smirked, swirling the drink in his glass. Danger? You mean the same people you've been protecting? I have to admit, Schindler, you're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Do you really think you can change the course of this war with a handful of Jews in your factory? Schindler's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his anger show. He knew that Goeth was toying with him, trying to get a reaction. But this wasn't about pride. This was about survival. I'm not trying to change the war, Goeth, Schindler said, his voice steady. I'm trying to save lives. You know as well as I do that these people are being murdered. I can offer something in return. My factory is producing at full capacity. I can provide you with more goods, more workers. I can make sure that the production line never stops. But I need protection for them. They are vital to the war effort. Goeth leaned forward, studying Schindler with an unreadable expression. You think I care about your factory's production? He sneered. You're not the only one making goods for the Reich, Schindler. I'm not here for your trade deals. What I want is loyalty. I want you to prove that you're on my side, that you're one of us. And I want you to show me that you're willing to sacrifice for the cause. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Schindler's mind raced as he tried to keep his composure. What Goeth was asking for was more than loyalty. It was complicity in a system that was built on murder. He had already made his decision. He couldn't turn back now. But he needed to buy more time to figure out a way to protect his workers without sacrificing his own humanity. "I'm not asking for anything in return for myself," Schindler said, his voice steady. "I'm asking for a chance to save them. You can make the difference between life and death, Guth. If you let me protect my workers, if you allow them to stay in the factory, I will make sure the Reich gets everything they need." Guth's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional clink of Guth's glass. Schindler's heart raced as the moment of truth arrived. "Very well," Guth said, finally leaning back in his chair, his voice dripping with malice. "You have my protection, for now. But don't think for a second that this is a free pass. I'll be watching you, Schindler. If you step out of line, I'll make sure you regret it." Schindler breathed a silent sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. He had succeeded in getting what he needed, temporary protection for his workers. But at what cost? He had made a deal with the devil, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Guth's twisted smile had been a warning. He had just painted a target on his own back. As Schindler left Guth's mansion, his mind churned with the gravity of the decision he had made. He had taken a dangerous risk, but he had to believe that it was worth it. He had bought time, but time was running out. The next morning, Schindler received news that would change everything. The Nazis had begun the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, and the workers he had saved, his workers, were now in even greater danger. He had no choice but to act quickly. In the dead of night, Schindler began to move his workers from the factory to a new location, one that he had secretly secured. The plan was simple: transport them to a place where they would be out of reach of the Nazis, a place where they could survive. But Schindler knew that even with Guth's protection, they were not safe. They were constantly at risk, constantly under threat. As the trucks rumbled through the dark streets, Schindler could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had made deals, compromised his values, and fought for the lives of those who depended on him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was just beginning. The next morning, as Schindler stood at the window of his office, staring out at the factory below, he knew that the coming days would be the most dangerous yet. The war was reaching its climax, and the stakes had never been higher. Schindler had made an enemy of the Nazis, and the consequences of that would be felt for the rest of his life. The crisis had arrived. The choices Schindler had made would either lead to salvation or destruction, for him, for his workers, and for the countless others whose lives hung in the balance. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The factory floor hummed with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. The machines churned out goods at a frantic pace. But for Schindler, every moment felt like a ticking clock. His heart was in his throat, a constant reminder that every passing second could mean the difference between life and death for the people he had sworn to protect. His workers, his family now, were depending on him. That morning, word came that the Nazi officers had begun rounding up Jews from the ghetto, moving them to the camps. Schindler's blood ran cold. He had hoped for more time, but he knew that time had run out. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time to play politics. He had to act. The trucks were waiting, hidden in the alley behind the factory. Schindler had made arrangements with his trusted associates to transport his workers to a secret location. The plan was risky, dangerously so. If the Nazis caught wind of what was happening, the consequences would be catastrophic. But Schindler had no choice. Every day that passed, more people died. The urgency was consuming. As Schindler entered the factory, his eyes immediately locked onto the faces of his workers. They were ready. They had been preparing for this moment, though none of them knew exactly what was to come. There was fear in their eyes, but there was also a glimmer of hope, a hope that Schindler had somehow ignited in them. "I can't promise you safety," Schindler said, his voice shaking with emotion as he addressed the group. "But I will do everything I can to get you out of here, to get you to safety." The workers nodded, some of them holding back tears, others clutching onto each other for support. Schindler felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced it down. This was not a time for weakness. The decision had been made long ago. His duty was clear. He was their protector now, and he would not let them down. Schindler moved quickly, directing his workers into the trucks, making sure each one of them was accounted for. The noise of the factory, the sound of trucks starting up, of doors slamming shut. It all seemed to fade into the background as Schindler focused on the task at hand. He had to get them out of there. The world outside was growing more dangerous by the minute. But just as the last truck was ready to leave, a chilling voice rang out from the entrance of the factory. It was the voice of Eamon Girth, the same officer who had once mocked Schindler, who had once been the embodiment of everything Schindler had despised. Girth was here, and he had brought a squad of SS soldiers with him. Schindler's heart sank. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the scent of danger. Girth was smiling as he approached Schindler, his eyes cold and calculating. "I see you've been busy, Schindler," Girth said, his voice dripping with menace. "Trying to smuggle these people out, are you?" Schindler took a deep breath, forcing his fear into the background. He had made it this far. He couldn't back down now. "These people are essential to the war effort," Schindler said, his voice firm, despite the knot in his stomach. "You need them. They're valuable to the Reich." Girth stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Schindler. "Valuable, you say? I see nothing but Jews trying to escape their fate. And you, Schindler, are helping them. That makes you a traitor." Schindler's mind raced. He had no illusions about the man in front of him. Girth was unpredictable, dangerous. If Schindler pushed too hard, if he said the wrong thing, it could all come crashing down. But then, something inside Schindler snapped. He had come too far, risked too much to let this man take away the lives he had fought so hard to save. "You're wrong, Girth," Schindler said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "These people have as much right to live as anyone else. You're the one who is wrong." For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. The SS soldiers behind Girth shuffled nervously, waiting for their orders. But Girth didn't break his gaze. He seemed almost impressed by Schindler's defiance, though it was a dangerous kind of admiration. He raised his hand, signaling for his soldiers to hold their fire. "You've got guts, Schindler. I'll give you that," Girth said, his tone now almost casual, though his eyes betrayed the violence lurking beneath. "But it's not enough. You can't protect them forever." Schindler didn't respond. Instead, he motioned to the trucks, signaling to the workers to keep moving. They were so close to safety. The tension was unbearable, a silent standoff between life and death. But then, at the last possible moment, Girth took a step back, his eyes flickering with what could have been doubt. For just a moment, Schindler thought he had won, that this nightmare was finally over. But then Girth spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this is the end, Schindler? You think you can save them all? You can't run forever. The war will end, and when it does, we'll see who survives." And with that, Girth turned and walked away, his soldiers following in tow. Schindler watched them leave, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had been given a reprieve, but only for the moment. The danger was far from over. As the trucks rumbled out of the factory, the workers in the back looking to Schindler with gratitude and fear, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. He had managed to save them for now, but at what cost? The war was closing in, and Schindler had made powerful enemies. He had put himself at great risk, and the consequences of his actions could be more far-reaching than he could imagine. But as the truck sped away into the darkness, Schindler couldn't afford to think about the future. For now, the workers were safe, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. But deep down, Schindler knew that the true cost of his actions was yet to be paid. He had defied the Nazis, defied Girth, and in doing so, had set in motion a series of events that would change the course of the war and his life forever. And as the rumble of the trucks faded into the night, Schindler felt the weight of his choices settle heavily upon him. The battle was far from over, but for today, they had won. The war was over. The sound of gunfire, the deafening roar of bombs falling, had faded into history. The world was left to reckon with the devastation, the loss, and the unimaginable horrors that had taken place. But for Oskar Schindler, the battle was far from won. The price of his choices was only beginning to show itself. In the months that followed the liberation of the workers Schindler had saved, his life took a dramatic turn. The gratitude of those he had rescued was beyond measure, yet the cost of his actions weighed heavily upon him. Schindler's wealth had been drained, his factory dismantled. The money he had once accumulated through his various business ventures had been spent on bribes, protection, and ensuring the survival of those under his care. His fortune was gone, and with it, his status in the eyes of the world. Schindler returned to Germany after the war, a man completely altered. The man who had once reveled in the power that wealth provided now found himself struggling to survive. His friends, the ones he had relied on during the darkest times, had disappeared, either gone into hiding or locked away in the aftermath of the war's end. The Jewish people he had saved were no longer under threat from the Nazis, but the world they returned to was a world forever marked by the scars of the Holocaust. He lived in near obscurity, disconnected from the fame that his name had garnered in the years following the war. He was celebrated by some, those who understood the depth of his sacrifice, but for the most part, Schindler found himself isolated, his every thought consumed by the faces of the people he had saved and the people he hadn't been able to. The faces of the dead, those whose lives had been snatched away before he had a chance to act, haunted him in his quieter moments. Schindler's relationship with his wife, Emily, was strained. The toll of the war had worn them both down. They had been through so much together, and yet they were growing further apart. She had been his rock during the darkest of times, but as the war's aftershocks reverberated, Schindler found himself lost in a new kind of battle, one he didn't know how to fight. There were no more enemies to face, no more victories to claim. He was just a man trying to survive in a world that had been irrevocably altered. In the years after the war, Schindler remained in Germany, far from the lives he had saved, and far from the people who would have understood his sacrifices. The world had moved on, and Schindler, a man once at the heart of life-saving decisions, now lived in the quiet shadows of history. The recognition of his deeds came slowly, and though he was eventually celebrated as a hero, Schindler could not escape the cost of his actions. The survivors of Schindler's List went on to rebuild their lives, but the scars of the Holocaust remained with them. They remembered Oskar Schindler not as a man who had saved them for his own glory, but as a man who had risked everything when others turned away. The legacy he left was one of compassion, of moral courage in the face of evil, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, no matter the personal cost. But for Schindler, the memories were not a source of pride. Instead, they were reminders of the heavy toll that moral decisions can take. His life after the war was not one of triumph, but of struggle. He lived quietly in the post-war years, working on small businesses and trying to rebuild what had been lost. He received recognition late in life, including the honor of being named righteous among the nations by Israel. But the scars of his sacrifices were deeply etched into his soul. In 1974, Oskar Schindler passed away in the town of Hildesheim, Germany, at the age of 66. By then, most of the people he had saved had lived long, fruitful lives, many of them with children and grandchildren, all of whom owed their very existence to his actions. Schindler's grave, located in Jerusalem, became a site of pilgrimage for those who recognized the enormity of what he had done. Despite his death, Schindler's legacy lived on in the lives of those he had saved. His story was immortalized in books, films, and documentaries, none more famous than Schindler's List, which brought his actions into the light for the world to see. But the man himself, in his final years, never sought glory or fame. He never sought the adoration of those whose lives had been spared. His was a story of quiet sacrifice, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and of an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when the cost was everything. As the survivors, the Jews he saved, looked back on their lives, they remembered Schindler not as a perfect man, but as a man who had transcended his circumstances and his background to act in a way few others had. He had seen the world for what it was, brutal and unforgiving, and yet he had chosen to be a light in that darkness, even when it meant risking his own safety and comfort. Schindler's story is a reminder to us all that in times of evil, in moments where humanity is pushed to its absolute limit, there are still those who choose to do what is right, no matter the consequences. It is a story of moral courage, of standing up when standing still would be the easiest option. It is a story that echoes the question that resonates through the ages. What would you do in the face of evil if the price was everything?